Hi everyone, we have done it. We've made it through the first month of 2025. It's already been quite a year, hasn't it? But I want to have a casual chat about everything that I read in January, both the good and the bad. There were definitely some books that I preferred over others. And I would love to hear in the comments, what was your first read of the year? It always feels like quite a significant thing, doesn't it? And let me know if you enjoyed it or not. Was it a positive experience? So I read 8 and a bit books in the past month. There's one that I'm still currently reading because it's a big whopper of a classic book, so it's going to take me a while to get through, but I'm going to talk about my thoughts and feelings about all these books. But before that, I want to talk about a fun book prize ceremony that I got to go to for the Bestseller Awards, which is organized by Nielsen Book Data. So as you might suspect, it is based on just sales of books, and I'd never heard of this award before, but it's a quite interesting one to think about because if you consider how in the publishing industry, like it's not the most lucrative industry, and some of the best-selling books, I mean, they're the ones that probably really keep these publishing houses going. So you can see a lot of the winners here, and it's a kind of fun thing that like everyone who attended was a winner because they were all bestsellers, and they were organized into different categories. So there were silver awards for authors that had sold over 250,000 books. There were gold awards for authors who sold over 500,000 books, and there were platinum awards for those that sold over 1 million copies, which is quite an incredible thing. Now, honestly, most of these books aren't ones that I'm all that interested in, but at the same time, yeah, you have to be like grateful for them to kind of be keeping the publishing industry going. And a really fun thing, so there were a number of authors there that I did know of about, like David Nichols and Bonnie Garmis, and also really excitingly, Stanley Tucci was there. And when I went to sit in the audience, just coincidentally, I just like found a seat like towards the back, and coincidentally, Richard Osman, the TV presenter and author, came and sat just like 2 seats away from me on the side, and then Stanley Tucci was sat in front of him. So Stanley Tucci wrote this book called Taste because, you know, he's a big foodie person as well as an incredible actor. I mean, I loved the movie Conclave recently, and he was so good in that, and he's so good generally. And of course, he's married to a literary agent, and so yeah, that was just like really fun to like be so close to these authors. And Richard Osman is really exciting being near to him. I wanted to like say something to him because a couple of years ago I had published this book called 50 Books to Read If You're an Armchair Detective, and I actually included in this book his book Thursday Murder Club. And so I kind of wanted to lean over and like mention that as like, oh, I wrote this fun little book about mysteries recommendations, and I included your book, but I wasn't quite brave enough to do that. But it was just like fun to be in like proximity to them and to see the awards and all of these authors, everyone receiving an award. It was kind of like wonderfully democratic in that way, in that everybody got an award. Now, so onto the books that I actually read this month, and one of the first books I read was actually a reread of Han Kang's Human Acts, translated by Deborah Smith. And of course, this great South Korean author won the Nobel Prize for Literature just a few months ago, and so I reread this because it was the choice for my online book club. So I read it together with a big group, and we had such fascinating discussions about it. Although some members kind of opted out of reading this because this is quite a serious book to read in January, you know, typically quite a glum month. And so to read such a serious and heartrending book that is also filled with so much violence was challenging, but also So inspiring and powerful what she does in this novel. So I'd first read this when this was first published, and so re-experiencing it now, it felt even more like impactful, especially with everything that's been going on in the world and recent. Protests and issues with the government in South Korea that have has happened in the past couple of months. It feels especially poignant to read it now. So the story concerns an uprising in a section of South Korea in 1980, and it follows the some people who are collecting the bodies that after a protest was suppressed, violently suppressed by the government and armed forces who killed a number of civilians, and so they are sort of organizing the bodies and caring for them. And we first follow a boy who's looking for a friend of his, the body of a friend of his, and we follow his perspective. But then it moves into the perspective of the boy that was killed, and so we sort of follow him in the aftermath of his life, and we follow a number of different characters over a period of years after this uprising, and seeing the continuing suppression of people by the government, of a number of people that were involved in this and other protest movements and union organizing movements, who were arrested and tortured, and we follow these characters over a period of time, and almost all these characters are kind of loosely connected with each other, so it does form a narrative arch, but also it's a tremendous statement about like the power of protest and exploring the meaning of what it means to be human, of that to stand up for ourselves and our liberty and our freedom is a powerful human act, but at the same time the armed forces that are suppressing and torturing and killing these individuals, they are also committing human acts. So it's questioning like what the meaning of humanity and where our humanity goes when we either fall in line with the demands of the government or stand up for individuals and community. And I found it such a powerful experience rereading this book, and I'm really looking forward to reading Han Kang's new novel very soon. Now, the next book I read was this was kind of a good way of like balancing out the seriousness of that experience, which is a new novel called Sweet Vidalia by Lisa Sandlin, who's actually a writer of I think crime fiction. I think she's written a number of books of crime fiction, but this is much more kind of literary fiction, like just following a woman throughout a very traumatic experience in her life, where it starts with a really arresting and shocking incident, and then her world is not only turned upside down, but inside out, because kind of everything she thought she knew about her life and those that were closest to her turn out to be false. And so she finds herself in a state of near destitution. And now, no, this doesn't sound like that sort of positive experience after that. And of course, it is dealing with this very like serious incident. But at the same time, the way that this novel is written, there's a kind of lightness to the narrative, but also it interjects some kind of comedy into this experience, as this woman who is in her mid-50s, and this takes place in the 1960s in Texas. She has to completely rebuild her life, and so she moves into this motel to attend business school to then try to find a job, because she has to support herself now because she has no money, and so it follows her through this period of like great transformation and really like establishing herself independently at this later stage of life, which is even more difficult, I think, than if she were younger and trying to start over again, because now her hands are riddled with arthritis, and she wants to do kind of secretarial work, which involves a lot of typing, which is a really big strain on her hands. And also she has two adult children who just aren't really in a position to help support her, and so she's really just on her own. And so we follow her through this period, and it's and I just really enjoyed this narrative as she makes connections with other people at the motel and at her school, a whole disparate group of people. And I think maybe she introduces too many characters because there's kind of too many storylines going on, but her central story, I think, is really strong and really powerfully conveyed. And I want to give you a little sense of the style of the writing in this, because when the central character Eliza just has an idea, she doesn't just write like, oh, she had an idea of what she might want to do. She's on a bus going on a trip to see her son and his family for Thanksgiving, and she writes, an idea strung with bunting, christened by champagne on some strange shore, emerged majestically in her harbor. It did not dock, but remained for the rest of the bus trip and several weeks after, close in on the clear water, ready to sail in either direction. And I just like this kind of elaborate style of narration that occurs at some point of to describe her experience. And I just love the kind of the flourish of that. And so I really enjoyed this book. And this author has been quite rightly compared to Anne Tyler and Elizabeth Strout. So if you enjoyed their writing, I think you'd really enjoy this book as well. And it was just a great reading experience. Now, I also read Murakami's most recent novel, The City and Its Uncertain Walls. And so I got this for Christmas, and it had been a long time since I read Murakami, because I read a lot of his books in my early 20s, but haven't for quite a while. And so it's kind of like revisiting this author whose sort of style and subject was immediately familiar, because he often writes about these kind of semi-lonely individuals that have a lot of romantic yearnings, and will often fantasize about women's breasts but also are really concentrated on both books and music. And that is what this novel is all about. It follows an individual who has a kind of childhood sweetheart who they're very close to each other, but she's very mysterious and seems to have this other life. And together they imaginatively create this city together in which she dwells. And so the narrative moves back and forth between him in reality, but then him in this kind of imagined city that they've created, which has a shifting wall around it, and the individuals that live inside live a very stripped down and austere existence, but there are also unicorns dwelling around, and so it's this kind of fantasy world, but it's also kind of a harsh reality, and it plays throughout the entire novel between our real lives and then this kind of shadow existence of a dreamlike world or the unconscious, or literally shadows. It plays with shadows in this imagined city. None of its citizens are allowed to have shadows, and as he is residing there, he goes to a library where there are no books, but there are cataloged dreams of people, and he has these special eyes to read everyone's dreams. So it's quite wild, the story, but most of it is just following this kind of semi-lonely guy as he's drifting around, longing for this woman who he can't entirely be with in reality or in this imagined city. And we follow him as he gets a job at a library, and things get even stranger as he meets a a kind of ghost in this library, but then also a very creative and very solitary boy who at this library, and about his interactions with him, and so yeah, they I mean, I kind of enjoyed following this narrative, but at the same time, it sort of felt like, oh, it got a bit like repetitive and wasn't really going too much anywhere. Although I did like kind of discussions about like, well, what is our real existence? Is it living in this reality, or is it the existence we make in our minds? And I think that's what this novel is playing with a lot. And it's interesting that there's an afterword in this where Murakami talks about how this was initially inspired by a short story or novella that he wrote when he was much younger, but that he set aside and didn't ever feel was like quite complete. And so he returned to it over the period of the pandemic, and then rewrote it and wrote an entire novel based on it. And yeah, it was interesting to read, but definitely not my favorite reading experience. And I don't feel like all that inspired to return to Murakami again. Although there are definitely other books of his that I haven't read yet that I still do want to read. But yeah, I don't know if this was entirely necessary for him to return to and then fill out and publish. I also read another Japanese book, a kind of modern classic called Confessions of a Mask by Yukio Mishima, and this so this was first published in the late 1940s in Japanese, and then was translated into English. And I read this with my in-person book club, so we got together and had a big discussion about it, which was really interesting because everyone had very different opinions of it. So this is a semi-autobiographical novel which follows a boy in Japan emerging into World War II, and we follow his coming of age story in through well, he recalls his birth at the very beginning of the book, and then through his childhood and adolescence and into his teenage years and early 20s, and following his process of development and sexual development as he becomes a man, and basically discovers fairly early on that he has an attraction for other men. And so for a novel at this time and in this country to be writing so openly about homosexual desire like this is really quite striking. But he attaches to this desire some really strange notions about like brutality and violence, and it gets all sort of twisted with his forming sensibility. He sees a picture of Saint Sebastian, who's sort of strung up and then penetrated by many arrows, and how this becomes like an erotically charged image for him that he becomes so fixated on. And so men that he desires, he sort of wants to see them like tied up, and he sees like really muscular and strong men as like the epitome of his desire. And then he talks about how other men that are just like intellectual and who aren't as strong, he doesn't have any desire for at all. So it creates this weird sort of like hierarchy in kind of like physical attributes, which is a bit strange, and then becomes I think kind of mixed in with other ideas about strength and power and ruling, which if you know the story of Mishima's life, you know that this is quite a like complicated thing for ideas for him to be exploring, because Mishima famously committed ritual suicide in a very public and like spectacle way, but also had very strong ideas about like empire, and he wanted to returned to like an old style of government, and had kind of like fascist ideas, and so quite a complicated individual, and then reading the ideas in this story to see how those kind of like fed into them, and also the character in this like has a real yearning for death, and so knowing that the author himself committed ritual suicide is quite a striking thing. So I had a really complicated experience reading this, and basically the second half of the novel is concerned of where he develops this like romantic fixation on a woman, and wanting to be sort of couple in this way to achieve a kind of normalcy, because he feels like that's what's expected of him, but also he seems to really have a passion for this woman, but it's more about kind of the idea of a relationship rather than the actual person, and that second part of the novel I felt like grew really repetitious and tedious. This was quite like challenging to read, but the members of my book club like had such different opinions of this. It was so interesting going around and hearing everyone's reaction to it, because people interpret it very different ways, and had different reactions to it. So it's a really interesting one to read for a book club, but I don't feel that drawn to reading Mishima's writing anymore, because like his a lot of his like logic is very convoluted, and so even though it's quite a like short book, I had to really concentrate on some of the passages to even understand what he was saying, and then when I did, I was like, well, I don't know if that really actually computes or makes sense, or is valuable to think about. I read a great graphic novel. It's been quite a while since I read a graphic novel, but A Guest in the House by Emily Carroll. And this novel follows a woman who's a fairly like self-contained individual. She just sort of works at a checkout in a convenience store. So I couldn't help thinking of convenience store woman, because feels like a very like self-contained individual, but she feels compelled to marry a man, a dentist who has moved to town, and who has an adolescent daughter from his first marriage after his wife had died. And so she's married this man, and they're living in this lake house, and but then strange things start occurring. And there's the kind of specter of his first wife that makes appearances to this woman, and so it's a kind of like Rebecca-like story as well, and it maintains this level of like psychological tension throughout the novel, as we wonder, like, is this all just inside of her head, and is she kind of losing the plot, or is her husband really a threatening presence, or is there something really supernatural happening here and going on in this house, or are all three of these things happening? And it maintains the level of tension throughout, like in a really interesting way, and that's portrayed in a really compelling way in the images, and some of them are very colorful and lively and expressive, and also she has this thing where in this kind of like fairy tale sense, where when she was younger she like envisioned herself as a knight and fighting for people, and so for women in particular, so there's a kind of homosexual tension in this as well, and I just found it really like compelling and really like tense and like psychologically rich story following this. So I think Emily Carroll's a really great writer. I also read Tim Winton's big most recent novel, which is kind of dystopian or post-dystopian story of a man and a child in Australia sometime far in the future, after there's been a big cataclysmic event, an environmental collapse, but then there are people that band together who are existing on the fringes, and as he has been doing, but there's also a kind of secret society of people rebelling against the powers that be, because people live together in kind of loosely constructed communities, although everyone is really mostly out for themselves because resources are so scarce. And there are these great descriptions of terrifying descriptions of like these heat waves that come through, and these hot winds that will kill people, so they have to shelter themselves continuously from, and everyone in the world has been pushed down to kind of the poles because the middle section of our globe has become uninhabitable because of the changing climate. And so he and this mysterious girl are journeying and escaping from these hot winds, and they want to shelter in a hole where that's a former mine, where they discover a man who's already residing there, and they're trying to convince this man to allow them to come in so that they can shelter there. And so the entire narrative is the man speaking to this other man, trying to convince him and telling him the story of his life. And it took me a little while to get into this story, but once I did, I was so gripped by it. There's a great like tension that Winton creates over the course of the narrative, and the description in it is so rich of both the collapsed environment, but also the pain and struggle of trying to survive in this. It's so vividly portrayed, but also following his story, and also the question about how much can we really trust his perspective and narrative, because he has become basically like a double agent who is living a kind of normal life, but then also part of this force that is tracking down and punishing individuals who are basically the inheritors of large wealthy corporations, and who have been able to create these bunkers in which they have been able to exist for generations. And so there's this band of like outlaw individuals that are tracking down these survivors whose survival has been off from the backs of basically the entire world's population and the environment of our world, and tracking them down. And he has been very closely involved in this movement, and so we follow him through that. And it's a really powerful story, and a really different way of like thinking about our individual choices in a state of environmental collapse. And I found this really powerful. I also read The Edges by Angelo Tijssens, translated by Michele Hutchison. And this is a very short Dutch novel that's really melancholy reading experience, as I talked about in another video. But the story follows a man who's returned to his hometown after his mother has died, and he's helping to clean out her house, but he also reconnects with a man who was his first lover, and their sexual and emotional reconnection, and it's so powerful how there's this strong familiarity between these two characters, but at the same time they've lived for years apart and had no contact, and so there's a kind of awkwardness in interacting with each other again, which feels really true to life. If you ever meet someone that you were very close to at one point in your life but haven't seen or communicated with for years and years, there's a whole like strangeness of where you feel like you really understand each other, but at the same time you've kind of grown apart and grown differently from the person that you once were and the people that you once were. And so I found that really powerful, how he describes that experience throughout the novel, and but also this pain, which is still so much a presence in his mind of because he had an incredibly difficult childhood, and surviving through that, and so naturally going back to his hometown, it brings back all of these memories of what occurred before. And I found this a really like powerful short book. And also, I read on audiobook The Coin by Yasmin Zaher, which is a novel which I'm still trying to figure out what I think about this novel. I was keen to read it because it made some best books of the year lists at the end of 2024, and the novel follows a Palestinian woman who has recently moved to New York City, and she comes from a very wealthy family, and she's inherited a lot of money, but it's like held in a trust which she can't like fully access because like her older brother has control of it, and she has this kind of tragic past in that she lost her parents early on, and so has had to live fairly independently, and America for her and her family has always been a sort of thing of fixation. So she's moved to New York City. She's living in an apartment. She has a long-term boyfriend who she has a kind of tense relationship with, and she's become a teacher at an inner city school, even though she doesn't really need to work for money, but she's a very unconventional teacher. She doesn't stick to a syllabus, and she just kind of has this way of communicating with her students in a more freestyle way, and will like take them out to go see a poet read, and then like get everybody hamburgers. But she's also so has kind of OCD. She's so fixated on cleaning herself, and there are long passages and descriptions of her process of cleaning herself and her body. So it reminded me a little bit of Andy Warhol wrote this book called From A to B and Back Again. And there are sections in this book where Andy Warhol describes how he would have these long phone conversations with a woman who would describe to him in meticulous detail the process of cleaning her body. And so it kind of felt similar to that. And so I thought that was quite striking, but mostly those passages I thought were pretty tedious, and listening to all this like detail of someone that is like so consumed with their own processes. It's actually like quite dull hearing about their obsessive routines, because to everyone else they're just kind of like meaningless, but to her obviously they are incredibly important. So it's interesting, like considering though like why she is so fixated upon this and obsessed with cleanliness, and the descriptions of her being out in New York City and giving this kind of different view of both that city and America in general is quite original, and is something that I liked most about the novel. But the real meaning of the book, I wasn't really sure of. And so as she's cleaning herself, she describes this process of like snakes coming out of her body, and I wasn't really sure of the meaning or like significance of that, but also that when she was a child, she kind of swallowed a coin, and she's aware that this coin is still somewhere in her body, because she describes in detail how it's never left her body, and so this coin becomes this like big presence for her that feels like it's an unclean place that she can never fully clean, and so it describes her experiences with all of this, and and I just wasn't really sure of the overall meaning of the book. It has this quite like sort of like dark tone to it that is kind of like reminiscent of a Tessa Moshfegh, but also how she is so like obsessed with labels. There's a lot of like designer labels in this, and at one point there's a whole scheme where she gets involved with trying to acquire these special high class bags to be resold through someone that she forms this weird connection with, a homeless man, but who has impeccable taste, and so it's all a bit of a like a strange story, but does give this different perspective, which I'm still like thinking about, and but I can't quite make my mind about what I think about this book. And finally, I'm finally reading Thomas Mann's great big classic, The Magic Mountain, which I've been wanting to do for a long time, but now have the imperative to read it because I'm going to be reading with my online book club Olga Tokarczuk's most recent novel, The Impasium, in February, and which is kind of partly inspired by Mann's novel. So I want to read this first before then reading Tokarczuk's book. And this novel, so I'm about this far into it, and I'm quite enjoying it so far. It's following a young man who has gone to a sanatorium in high up in the mountains near Davos, and to see a cousin of his who's been staying there for a while, and whose stay keeps getting extended, and he just plans to go for a few weeks, but his stay starts getting extended as well. And so it's this kind of area that is like removed from the rest of society, and this is in the years leading up to World War One, and I'm finding it fascinating. It's like discussion of time because of this little community up in the mountains is so far removed from the rest of the world that they experience and feel time differently from other places in the world. And there's a lot of discussion about where our sense of time exists, like in our consciousness, and it talks about the relative nature of time, how when we go to someplace new and it have lots of new experiences, it feels like time is sort of being extended and it feels like it's longer. But when we get into routines and we just experience the same thing over and over again every day, time moves a lot more swiftly because there's almost like no difference in time. So it's how time impacts our memories, and the layered experience of our memories really shift our sense of time, which is quite an interesting argument. And so, but there's also the characters. So Hans is this young man that goes to stay there, and following Hans, like I'm finding him quite an endearing character, especially because it gets back into his memories of his family life and how he lost some family members, which I found quite moving. But also he's this individual that was like studying engineering and kind of like really directed in where he wants to go in his life, but now going to this health resort, he finds that he's like kind of removed from the future that he thought he was going to have, and how all of the many characters that he meets here all are like very fixated on themselves and obsessively about their own health. So it's interesting to talk about this alongside this modern novel, The Coin. But how he the discussions that he has with the many different residents, and kind of getting into their routines. They all consume a lot of like rich food and have this very like stationary existence, and this regimen where they have to have a rest cure every day, where they just lie out in the sun, even though it's very cold up in the mountains, and getting into these routines which make the days seem to cluster together really closely. And I'm finding some of it more engaging than others. There are some characters that will go off on these long, tedious speeches, which makes it feel like I'm sort of listening to some really boring uncle at like a family function, and just like kind of waiting to get through that. But I'm finding his character himself and some of the other characters much more engaging. So I'm keen to continue reading on with this and see how it goes. And then to get on to Tokarczuk's book, I think will be quite exciting. So that is everything that I read in January, and I'd love to hear if you have read any of these books and what you think about any of them, and if you agree or disagree with any of my opinions about them. But also, let me know about the first book or books that you have read in 2025 so far. I would love to hear about that in the comments below. But I hope you're doing well and reading good things, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.